Chapter 1.1 Beautiful Bones. An insert chapter. She could still remember the day he became her teacher was a brilliantly sunny day. In this generation of the Choi family of Chunhe, she was actually the only female in the lineage descent. The others had mostly died in infancy. Because of her family's great power and influence, when she was still in her mother's womb, her hands had already been promised to the marriage to the crown prince. According to her childhood wed nurse, if at that time a male had been born instead, the child would likely have been secretly swapped for a girl for the sole purpose that one day she would reside in the palace of the empress. Fortunately, it had been a girl. But at last this girl was born with the inability to speak. 'Tis for this reason she became the student of Shaonanshan Prince, the prince who held the control of a great army of 700,000, the one whom the Empress Dowager was most fearful of, and the youngest uncle of the crowned prince. He, however, was not born of the Empress Dowager himself. According to mother, this act would give her a strong supporter, and at the same time she could use her teacher discipline status with him to in the future bring the support of this uncle for the crowned prince. One move, two gains, two birds with one stone. She seemed to understand, yet not quite, in all the stakes and complicated interactions. But when she recalled that day, how a single wave from this teacher's hand had caused the entire army to kneel in illusion, and the air of authority he had emit, she had a feeling of eager anticipation. If she had not already secretly held a glance of him that day, she would have thought that Shaonanshan Prince was actually over 30 years old. However, he could not have such outstanding military achievement that caused the imperial family to tread cautiously with him. Under the observing eyes of many people, Xingyin very carefully and properly bowed and paid the ceremonial respect of the discipline to her teacher. Taking the cup of the tea someone beside her had handed to her, she gripped it with two little hands and one step at a time approached the young man who was sitting there in the center. The liquid in the cup swept back and forth slightly, causing ripples to form. With every step she took, she did not dare lose her focus until she finally stood before him and very respectfully raised the teacup above her head. She thought if it was any other disciplines, they would have reverently said, "Teacher, please have tea." But she could only stand there quietly. The only thing she could do was hold the cup steadily with both her hands. Very quickly, a hand took the cup from her. His other hand held the cup's lid as he gently took a sip. "Xingyin, you are called 11 at home." 11 raised her head and looked at him with sparkling eyes as she nodded. "As it turns out, I have 10 disciplines already. Would it be all right if I also call you 11? He did not address himself as your teacher and merely used I. Xingyin stared blankly at him in slight surprise and could not help glancing at her mother, who was far off to the side. Only after mother gave a nod did she also nod her head. She thought, such a strange teacher and prince. Many years afterward, when she thought about that day, she could still clearly remember it. He had been wearing a torso-colored long robe, and there seemed to be a smile on his eyes, like a warm ray of dazzling sunlight on a cloudy day. Shaonanshan Prince, whose name had become a renowned when he was still a youth and whose military feats were illustrated, yet still treated each one of his disciplined soldiers in general well, as from that day forward her teacher, and this was something that would never change for this lifetime. She was a future crown princess, so she was different from the other ordinary senior brothers and sisters. And in the prince manor, she had her own separate courtyard with its own entrance and her own personal maids. But it was also for this reason that in the first 2 years under his discipline, she had been ostracized because of her status, and those people did not dare do anything to her. but they treated her coldly as if she was a stranger. This did not overly affect her, as it was also because of her status that she even more or so had the teacher's affections. She would frequently accommodate him alone in his study and was even allowed to go up into the forbidden place of the Prince Manor, the library tower. Then when teacher became aware of their interactions and admonished them, all her senior brothers and sisters finally began to slowly accept her. She could not speak and would always smile, and her smile would make each person feel warm and happy. So although her outer appearance was merely average and not outstanding, everyone was fond of her. However, teachers still only allowed her alone to go up the library tower. Some senior brothers could not resist bringing a brush and paper to her and asking her what treasure were contained within there, that it would be a prohibited place to the Prince Manor. Each time she would shake her head and smiled, but not write anything, and occasionally her eyes would flicker away evasively. Inside the library tower was only 3 levels high, and all year round the scent of pines and bamboo pervaded the air. When the lamps were not lit, it was very dim, and the first time she went there, she had actually snuck in secret also. Shortly after, she had come to reside in the Prince Manor. The army of the enemy neighboring country had initiated a large-scale invasion of the border areas, and teacher had led an army into battle and defense. At the time, she did not know any other person, hands covering one wall of the library tower. In her handwriting were poems, and all of them one she had recited with her mother since she was a child. She did not really comprehend the meaning of those poems, but she was able to easily write them out. When Zhou Zhenchen returned, 2 entire walls of the library tower were covered with her writing. Unable to find her deep in the night, her maidservant had quietly sought out Zhou Zhenchen for help. If it was made known outside of the manor that the daughter of the Choi family of Chunhe had disappeared in the middle of the night, it would be a disgrace for the entire manor. The maidservant did not have the authority to make any decision and did not know what to do. Zhou Zhenchen therefore searched the entire manor alone until when he went to the top level of the library tower. He saw the girl child who had so carefully presented the tea to him on that day she became his discipline, writing Rhapsody of the Imperial part. The words flowed easily off her brush, and there was not a single error. But she was stuck on that one line that was about the feelings between a man and a woman. Beneath long curved brows, sidelong gaze are cast again and again. At a loss, she clenched her brush tightly and came down from the bamboo chair. She dared not even raise her head to look at her teacher, who in the moonlight had an amused expression on his face. "Have you forgotten the second half of that line?" Zhou Zhenchen walked over, got down on one knee, and asked her in a warned voice. 11 pressed her lips together, not really wanting to admit it, but in the end, still nodded silently. Teacher suddenly stretched out his hand and wiped away the ink on her face. The feels of his finger was somewhat rough, not soft like her mother, but it had the same warmth and the same gentleness. He let out a little laugh. The second half of the line is, "Beauty is offered, a soul is given in return, and the heart rejoices to be at one another's side." Her head whipped up and she looked elatedly at her teacher. When she turned around, wanting to climb back up onto the bamboo chair, she felt herself raising up into the air as he lifted her up from behind her. "Right, I will hold you." She nodded, feeling slightly nervous as well as somewhat delight, which resulted in the handwriting for these characters when she wrote them to be quite different from the others. She wanted to continue, but her teacher had already set her down. "Go to sleep now. When you complete your study, come back to finish the remainder." 'Tis within the library tower. There was an incomplete poem written in her handwriting. In her mind, she even thought of this as a secret. Later, as she gradually grew older, she was able to comprehend the true meaning behind this line. The woman offers her beauty, the man gives his soul in return. They develop mutual feelings and united heart, and the heart is poured out to that person beside. Each time teacher left the manor, it would be for a minimum of half a month, but could be as long as 3 months, and she would secretly go to the library tower. On some afternoon, she would open the window and there would always be a breeze that blew in. In the summer, it would be a little hotter and more oppressive, while in the winter, it would be a little chillier and more biting. If there was wind, then there would be noise, whether it was the moan and cry of the air passing through the several shelves or the swifting sound as it brushed over the scroll. In the beginning, she was small in stature and would always stand on the bamboo chair. But as she slowly grew older, she no longer needed to use it. She would never need to tell him, for Zhou Shenshen would still always be able to find her in that place. And then on the same column, he would measure whether she had grown taller in the time he had been away. Each time she unexpectedly saw him again, and after he returned, she would always be extremely happy but unable to express it with words. She would tentatively hook her index finger around his little fingers and swayed her hand, refusing to let go of him. 11. Whenever he spoke to her, he would always lower himself onto one knee and use a gentle tone. You look the prettiest when you are smiling. Always smiled, yes? The corner of her lips turned up into a smile. Days passed, months elapsed, years slipped by. Qing, chess, choreographer, and painting, she was not an expert in all of them. She had a preference for chess and painting. The former she could use to pass the time with teacher in the library tower, while the latter she could use when teacher was taking care of official matters to capture his appearance and expression. She dared not blatantly paint him and would hide everything. Those eyes that demurred, imposed, his every frown or smiled. The teacher who was asleep, tired, or filled with rage because of the battlefield situation, and amongst painted flowers, grass, and landscape. Only she could look at them, only she could understand them. She was forbidden to leave the Prince Manor, so naturally her views of the world were much more limited than her seniors and brothers. Once every 10 days, they would come together for a shared dinner, and each time, she would always be able to listen to the senior brothers who have already accompanied teacher out to the battlefield, before enthusiastically describing how his sword would direct the armies of the thousands, and he would lead the charge before his shoulder, and then her senior sister would recount what was said of teacher and his reputation in the marketplace gossip. 11. Do you think that teacher is very handsome? She paused briefly in surprise and thought for a moment, and then gave a slight nod of her head. If teacher could not be considered handsome, then there was no one in this world who was pleasing to the eyes. Have you ever heard of beautiful bones? Her youngest senior sister leaned against her shoulder and whispered, Beautiful bones. Real in this world, those with bones do not have skin, and those with skin do not have bones. Shaonan Shen Prince is the only man in this world who has beauty of both the skin and bones. The common folks all say that this is even more real than having an emperor's bones. The last part of what this little senior sister had said were words of hearsay. Shaonan Shen Prince, the one who had thousands of retainers who had sworn allegiance to his family, holds the control of an army of 700,000, and as a magnificent military accomplishment should have divided up the land, created new boundary, and established a new order and just round. Her eyes flashed. She knew this senior sister had indulged too much in drink and had forgotten that this junior sister, who could not engage in gossip, was actually the crown princess. A person whose existence was for the sole purpose of becoming worthy of the imperial family and for gaining the support of Shaonan Shen Prince. Flustered from listening to this, and after dinner, she secretly slipped up into the library tower again. She had not expected that though that teacher would be there. The lamps and candle unlit as he stood beside the window. Lost in thought, through the gaps between the wooden shelves, she stood and watched teacher from afar. She thought of her senior sister's words, beautiful bones. Those words may have sounded beautiful, but they were also like shackles. Grounding, tired from her watching, she sat down and drifted off to sleep. The next time she opened her eyes, the sky was already starting to brighten, but she did not see her teacher. There was only his long robe that was covering her body. The garment was cold, and he had likely left long ago. This was the first time that she had fallen asleep here, and teacher had not carried her down out of the tower. Xinyan's fingers followed the cuff of the sleeve and gently traced a circle around its edge. This action alone already caused her cheeks to grow hot. Many years ago, she had already known how to recite up to beneath the long, curved brows, sidelong gazes are cast again and again. It was he who had taught her. Beauty is offered, a soul is given in return, and the heart rejoices to be at one another's side. Now she truly was in a state where beauty had been offered, and a soul had been given in return, and love had bewitched her mind. Late into the night, she had wrote a letter pleading to her mother to break off her betrothal. Her mother sent a letter and replied, but not a single word mentioned about breaking the betrothal, and instead what she spoke of was some of the rumors that were circulating around the ordinary people. A rumor amongst the common folks was that Shaonanshan Prince and the Crown Princess had a illicit relationship, paying no heed to their relationship as teacher and discipline, and disregarding ethic and social order. A rumor among the common folks was that Shaonanshan Prince had the intention of raising an army to change the ruling surname and declaring his sovereignty. Among another rumor, the common folks was that the Trey family of Chandher had already joined with Shaonanshan Prince Manor, offering up both his beautiful daughter in the world for the purpose of being granted a division of the land so that the family claim could be made line of the king's. My child, guard your words and your actions. The entire family line in the childhood is held in your hand. She folded the letter, removed the glass cover protecting the candle of the lamp, and placed the letter in the flame until it had completely burned away. Imperial indicts from the palace expressed in goodwill were frequently received, and the crown prince, as the heir apparent to the throne, personally visited the manor and sought to appease Shaonanshan Prince. The lord and his minister were so harmonious in their relationship, as if to proclaim to the world that the rumor was strictly rumors, and that the relationship between the imperial household and the line of the Shaonanshan Prince and the Trey family of Chenherd was close, strong, and unshakable. On her 17th birthday, by her mother's order, she was to leave the Shaonanshan Prince Manor in this city, Changnan, that she had lived for 10 years, yet had never once even seen the bustling of its street and marketplace. That day was also a brightly sunny day. It was a seldom seen time when her teacher was in the manor with no matters to attend to, and he was sitting and leaning back into the bamboo chair in his study. When she entered to bid her farewell, sunlight was shining in through the window, casting vulturing shadow upon him and causing him to be partly in the light, partly in the dark. His eyes were clear like water as he raised his head and quietly gazed right at her. 11 very carefully and properly paid the ceremonial respect of the discipline to her teacher, kneeling down on both knees and pressing her forehead against the blue stone slabs of the floor. One who is teacher for one day is regarded as a father for a lifetime. Her bow was to bid farewell to those 10 years of his loving kindness, raising and teaching her. The Empress Dowager has issued a decree that I adopt you as my daughter. 11. Would you be willing to have this pass? She rose her back to her feet and very gently shook her head. That bow from a moment ago had already concluded their relationship as teacher and disciplined. She did not want to still have anything binding to him after she stepped out of the prince's manor. He gave a small smile. Then this prince shall for this once defy the decree. 11 walked up before him and leaning up against the side of the bamboo chair. She bent her knees slightly and looked carefully at him. There was a touch of weariness between his brows. Unconsciously, she reached out her hands, wanting to touch his face. Just this once, after this one time, she will leave Chandan and return to Chenhe. He sensed her motion and raised his eyes a little to look directly at her. She was frightened, not knowing whether she should pull back her hand or forthrightly touch his face. And in that brief still moment, he had already leaned forward slightly, complimenting her action, placed his face gently onto her hand. Her fingers had a slight tremble, but they still stubbornly held their course and slid from his brows down to the bridge of his nose. Beautiful bones, she thought. What about these beautiful bones was so special that even the imperial households would be wary of them, that they would be on the lips of everyone in the land? Beauty is offered, a soul is given in return. This was describing a woman offering up her beauty and a man giving his soul in return. But with her plain, unremarkable appearance, how could she possibly merit the words, beauty is offered? She quietly pulled her hand back. He suddenly gave a little laugh and asked her, You have been in Channan for 10 years, but 11 you still have not seen the true Channan city, have you? She nodded, and after thinking about it, she could not refrain from giving a rueful smile. I will bring you for a look. She was all taken back, but when she remembered her mother's letter, she hesitantly shook her head. And only after he had ordered someone to bring her a hat with the black gauze covering her entire face, with only her eyes showing, did he finally take her out of the prince's manor. Under the bright sun shining high in the sky, in the noisy street, he and she rode together on the single horse as he softly told her the name of every place and explained what was unique about each of them. The places where his long whip was present should have been battlefields of life and death, of fighting and killing. But on that day, it was merely there in Channan city province, terrace, towers, wine shop, and street. He did not wear his princely robe, and she was covering her face. He was no longer her teacher, and she was also no longer his discipline. From a distance, all that anyone could see was a simple girl with bright, limpid eyes, sitting on a horse, and the extremely graceful postman who held her into his arms in front of himself. This was the city of Chandan, where she had lived for 10 years. The day that she left the prince's manor was also the day that he once again led troops out into battle against enemy armies. After 10 years of wars and fighting, the border areas has been plunged of threats, and neighboring countries were terror-stricken by simple words of his presence. This battle was merely a warning to all the lands and did not have any risk to his life. She believed as such. But 10 days later, she arrived at the ancestral manor of the Trey family of Chenhe, and under the personal tutelage of the crown prince's childhood wet nurse, she began to learn wedding etiquette and ritual. The wet nurse seemed to have heard much about her various errors and wrongdoing, and her words and contentions were harsh, deliberately finding fault in every aspect. In silence, she remembered every important point and disregarded the mockery and the scorn in her words, until an emergency request for aid came from the borderland. His Imperial Highness, the Crown Prince, personally went out to battle, bringing reinforcement troops to Shaonanshan Prince. It was then that she felt that there was something amiss. From the time Shaonanshan Prince was 16 years of age and had mounted his horse to enter the battlefield, he had never once been defeated. where his sword pound would surely be a bewildering sea of blood, and he would unquestionably return in triumph. What virtue or abilities could a crown prince who had spent all his days and rest in the imperial palace possibly have that he would dare to lead the reinforcement out to battle? There was no one for her to pose her question, and for the people surrounding her were either her father and brother or were those belonging to the imperial family. She remembered in her 10 years in the prince manor, if she had fallen asleep, Chou Chen would always carry her back to her room herself, for the fear that she would be affected by cold and fall ill. With even the slightest sickness due to invasion of the wind colds in her body, she would be in his room drinking a tea brewed from purple pillar leaf. In contrast, now that she had returned home, even on days when snow was falling thickly, she would still need to stand barefooted on the bluestone tiles and learn how to climb onto the daybed to wait upon the monarch. Half a month later, her mother came to watch her as she practiced over and over again the proper movement and posture for seating oneself, and after a long while, her mother finally wordlessly handed her a note. The words were written in the handwriting seeming as if it had been hastily composed, but so familiar it caused her heart to pound and feared. Chen in this life never forsook the world, and has only forsaken 11. In her bare foot, she stood on the bluestone tiles and listened to her mother. One word, one sentence at a time, describes to her how on that night 3 days ago, Shaonan Prince had just before the battle turned into rebellion and seized the crown prince in a futile attempt to usurp the throne and become emperor himself. Fortunately, Shen Yin's father and eldest brothers were present and protected His Imperial Highness. The nearly successful rebellion finally failed, and Shaonan Prince was granted the punishment of death by deboning. What was meant by deboning? It was for the lone reason that his beautiful bones were widely known in the land. The crown prince, therefore, before all the people of the land, scraped out the beautiful bones from his body to serve as an example and warning to the people. Her mother's eyes of wide her eyes wide, and she fixed her gaze upon her mother. Her mouth opened, but words would not come forth. This life she possessed of mouth and tongue, but yet was unable to produce speech. She was not even able to ask how he had left this letter behind. Who has forsaken whom? As 11 held that piece of paper, she could not prevent her body from trembling. She remembered how that day before she had departed, her fingers had felt over every feature of his face, not wanting to forget even the smallest detail about him. But now, what remained in this reunion was merely paper and final words written before death. His one statement that he had never forsaken the world was clearly telling her that he had been set up and the accusation against him were falsified. Her father and her eldest brother had wronged him, and the imperial family had wronged him. As for her, how could she remove herself from this matter? 11 carefully folded up the note and placed it inside her garment collar beside her heart. She then continued to silently practice over and over again how to sit properly. 11. In this life, did you ever have someone whom you would like to be with, to share that person's ending? The answer to this question she had known already long ago. According to historical record, Chou Chen, the Shaonan Prince, a life of unceasing fighting and war, exemplary of the wholehearted loyalty, but in the prime of his life was marred by fame and glory and gradually developed desire to rebel against the state. The trade family of Chen He fortunately saw through, and throughout his scheme, Shaonan Prince was captured. The crown prince's hatred ran deep into his bones, and he bestowed the punishment of death by deboning upon him. The sentence was carried out for a full 6 hours, but there was not a single cry or howl of anguish. Even to death, he refused to repent. Throughout his life, Shaonan Prince took no wife and no offspring. but repeated allegations of his secret illicit relationship with the crown princess were circulated. 4 days after Xiaonanshan Prince's death, the crown princess also departed this world. There were rumors that she had hung herself from the rafter of one of the 10 chand, a tall tower in the Prince Manor, while other accounts said that she had thrown herself from the city walls of Changnan. Opinions have differed, and there were no conclusive arguments. All that remains within the library tower of the Prince Manor was the Crown Prince writing, written with her own hands, in the entire poem of Rhapsody of the Imperial Park. This story was passed down the ages until it became one praised and passed by the people. His life of magnificence, of greatness, was with these few words completely buried and forgotten by the world. In this life, 26 years have passed already. Xingyan leaned against the window, looking out beyond the car window at the street sign that were speeding by. She could not help giving a heartfelt sigh over the good weather. There was not even a trace of cloud in the azure sky, so even one's mood was pleasant because of this. The taxi's cab whole journey had been flowing and unreplanted, and even after she was out of the car, her check-in procedure was smooth. However, inside the security, both times she passed through the metal detector, the alarm had sounded loudly. The most frustrating part was the alarm over the other side of the security line next to her was blaring incessantly as well. She wondered who was having the same Welsh luck as her and had encountered an unreasonable metal detector. "Miss, would you mind taking off your shoe? We need to check again." She nodded and sat down on one of the chairs off to the side. As she was lowering her head to remove her shoe, she saw the backside view of the man in adjacent security's checkpoint. A very tall and very straight-backed man. When she noticed him, he was picking up his laptop computer. On the other end of the security checkpoint, the long queue wound back like dragon, and on its end, it was only the two of them behind the inspect. "Mr. Chu Shenchen." The man guarding the security checkpoint was holding the passport he had left behind. "You've forgotten your passport." "Thank you." He turned around. Sensing her gaze at him, he lifted his eyes to look over at her. The instant of eye contact seemed to suppress all the chaos and noise surrounding them. Nothing else concerns her anymore. Xingyan stared deeply at him, unable to move her gaze away. She wanted to laugh and at the same time wanted to cry, but either way she could not speak, not even half a word. He had come after all. Chu Shenchen, you have come after all.